All right, so now we're going to get into the discussion part where I'm going to play the role of both participator and moderator, or as Andy coined, I will be your particimod.
Or your manager.
I want to start by just consulting the audience. So hands up if you think that this is an amazing piece of marketing from Anthropic. Okay. And I'd say that was probably most, right? Majority?
Oh, I reckon most people just don't put their hands up. So yeah, I think it was most.
Yeah. And hands up if you think this is, a genuinely almost existential threat to, critical infrastructure.
Oh, wow. Okay, take it back.
Yeah, okay. I kind of think it's both.
It is a bit of both, definitely,
I think it is. So one of the questions that we kind of put in our notes beforehand was, what has the reaction been? And I think one of the answers to this question of is it marketing and is it a risk is it has highlighted that the incredible piece of marketing has made CEOs of, Fortune 100 companies incredibly aware of the risk, and it's focusing the mind and budgets on what do we do to address this? How do we tackle this? What kind of reactions have you seen with your customers, with open source projects? Is it giant panic all over?
I mean, it depends if they've got glass ring access. Those with access have gone, oh. And fundamentally, as we said, you can throw models at the latest versions. The curl maintainer has said it actually only found one thing against the latest version. Extremely high quality code base, great maintainer, loads and loads of eyes on the thing. So yeah, no surprise. If you're running curl from 5 years ago, it's going to pop that all over the place. If you've got that installed as a library somewhere, if you've taken out a little bit of code and stuck it in somewhere else, you don't even have a CVE correlation. And that really is the danger zone. So it's not so much a huge step in model capability, but it's really just widened the attack surface to a point that all of a sudden, the vulnerability depth for running 5-year-old open source, or even after reverse engineering some firewall code, turns out you've got 10-year-old snippets of open source code stuck in firewalls that we probably all have in our organizations. Very poor practice, and now the bill is coming.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can't really say too much, but we're having a lot of conversations, and yeah, I know Dan's been pulled into a lot of conversations, so things have gone crazy on our end as well, yeah. The other thing I'd say is people, you see enterprises still quite commonly stuck in things like old versions of Java. I think it's those ones that are really sort of panicking at the minute. And yeah, people are realizing, well, okay, maybe we do have to update and get things fixed.
So can we fix this with supply chain security approaches that, we've been focused on that for so long since particularly the Biden era directive. Is it going to help us get out of this Mythos effect problem?
I guess we'll see. I think somebody mentioned, Dan Lawrence wrote a blog post recently called the hardest fork. And so one of the problems we're going to have, presumably, is we'll have open source project everybody relies on, but the maintainers, might be slow to patch. Because, it's not, like you mentioned, they're not getting paid. If I'm an open source maintainer, why should I be on the hook for every vulnerability and constantly working when you're not paying me? So what happens to those projects that are slower to update? Right? They still need to be patched if you're running it in production. Does that mean that every AWS, every Google, every large enterprise company is going to have to fork and have their own updated versions? Because that's a terrible place. Or is there going to be some sort of, you said clearinghouse, there's going to be some sort of way where we have a centralized authority responsible for keeping things up to date. And so you get into, and that's what, Dan Lawrence was arguing, that we need something like that, but that seems very hard to do as well. So we're in a very strange place with supply chain security as well. We need to keep everything up to date and secure, but it's not entirely clear how we get there.
Yeah, I agree that there's a freshness and recency issue for the code itself, for third-party code. There is the speed of ingestion, which is not in a great place generally. And yeah, that question of a vulnerability is found, it is disclosed via the appropriate and embargoed channels to a maintainer who is silent for 30 days. And I think the number was 6% of Mythos patches that have actually been accepted. There is no commercial incentive for those people to actually do anything. I'd like to see a world where instead of GitHub sponsors, people just start getting paid for hygiene, and then that payment stops if they're not doing it. So, the first hit's free. We haven't tried this before. It's pretty outlandish, and it's not going to stand up in the amount of time that's necessary. But finding that commercial market anchor into the thing would be useful from that perspective. From a wider supply chain question, I mean, where do those patches sit if the maintainer doesn't take them? Well, on the one hand, would you just create a repo by an organization by the side of it, drop your patch code in there? Obviously, the problem there is, well, suddenly the models can look that up, they know what the exploit, they can generate the exploit, and then you've kind of doxed the vulnerability. I don't think that's a valid concern because we've been equalized. The models, the open source models, can do the Mythos thing with DeepSeek. They've reached parity, and that had already happened. And from the marketing perspective, maybe that's where they did a better job than not. So, if you then end up with 1 million stars on one repo and then 1 star on the actually secure repo, how do you then point? And we've got organizations, JFrog, Nexus and Sonatype and those places where they have potentially the capacity to put some sort of pointer into the right repo, but who's going to take the liability? And maybe that's then a service that can be sold. How does that sit with the CRA? What happens if you point to the wrong? Lots of unanswered questions there. But the other question around the supply chain and how actually supply chain security exists, there's a wonderful project that's very underused, and I know that Chainguard use it and a number of other places, called VEX. And it's the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange format. It's taken me many years to untangle my tongue from that particular phrase. And a VEX document will turn a scanner green when it has a CVE. And while in this case, that's not actually the primary benefit. The most important thing here is it contains a field to describe mitigation. So if I have a vulnerability in OpenSSL and it's for a function, it's for a cryptographic function from the 80s. I run symbolic analysis or I look at the tree of my code, it doesn't get called. I've still got a vulnerability in my code. My manager is going to be very unhappy that I don't want to patch it. VEX says, this particular field allows you to say, doesn't apply to this piece of software. You sign that with your central vulnerability management team, you put that into your scanning pipelines, it's picked up by all the scanners, and then it turns the scanner green. The liability then is on the vulnerability assessor to make sure that they've done that correctly. You've also got a field in there which says, we've mitigated this in a different way. This is running vulnerable code in production, just to be clear. So it is a difficult thing to do, but when the cost of patching may be exorbitant, this is a stopgap. Log4Shell, for example, all of a sudden, boom, everyone's vulnerable. What's the mitigation? Well, it's interpolation, people getting command and control, firewall the thing. If you can turn off networking for that application, you've then mitigated the vulnerability. You can run that in production until such time as you can patch the thing, and the VEX document will allow that field. There are more complexities because if you don't have full networking control within, I mean, obviously GitOps is a deep passion, but you've got your immutable container, got your immutable configuration version, you might have a firewall control outside of the infrastructure. So there's still rough edges to the thing, but from a supply chain perspective, those are the tools that we have.
I'm going to throw in, because I think mitigation is the key to unlocking this problem of, the patching window has become negative. We cannot patch in time. So what we can do is runtime mitigation. And this is where those of you who have ever seen me in the last 5 years will not be surprised to hear me mention eBPF. And this is something that we've been working on for quite a long time, but the Mythos effect has kind of brought the, urgency to this. The idea that you are running vulnerable code, as you say, you cannot avoid. You can't reboot all your systems as soon as you find out about every vulnerability. But we can use eBPF. So for those of you who maybe don't know, eBPF is a technology that allows us to change the way that the kernel behaves in real time. So we can actually do this dynamically underneath running applications. So we might have an application that has a vulnerability we can essentially do this kind of firewalling, putting a very small granular shield, is what the terminology we're using now for this, so a runtime shield that can prevent that exploit, buying time for you to then roll out the proper patched updates in the future. So yeah, I think, and this is not to say that supply chain security is not important, because absolutely it is. But I, for one, don't believe that supply chain security can fix this alone. I think we need this kind of runtime mitigation as well.
I'm going to maybe not exactly disagree, but certainly I've got a slightly different viewpoint on this. So VEX is useful, but I think it's more useful in exceptional circumstances. I think what Chainguard actually kind of proved was that, before Chainguard, it was very hard to get to zero CV using container images. You took any container image that you got from
Anybody here ever worked in an organization that had zero CVEs? I don't think that, I think it's a mythical organization.
Well, you say that, but that's what we did. We built images with zero CVEs, and we proved you can do this. All you've got to do is make them smaller and keep everything up to date. And then you do get to zero CVEs in container images at least. And so I think where you need to be is much closer to keeping things up to date and patching them and rebuilding them and redeploying them. Like Google talk about the build horizon. So even if, say a service running in production in Google hasn't seen, the code that it runs hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. In a week or however many weeks, I'm not quite sure what the number they use is, they'll still replace that with a newer version, because although that code hasn't changed, you can bet that its dependencies have. So it still needs to be taken down, rebuilt, and replaced. So I think, keeping things up to date and keeping everything up to date is going to be much, much more important in this world. And yes, VEX can be useful, but I think it's more useful in the exceptions. And eBPF and so on is definitely useful, because you're also going to have to think defense in depth. Don't just rely on being up to date. Don't just rely on the firewall. Have intrusion detection and so on, and have multiple ways of securing your systems.
So we've actually done this in some Cisco switches now support this kind of eBPF mitigation. Cisco equipment has been, there have been some very, very serious CVEs found in recent months, and they can be mitigated using this approach. So it's proving its worth, and I think we are now in a world where people recognise that we can't rebuild and patch quickly enough. So people are prepared to take that risk of rolling out runtime security, which traditionally people have seen as scary. Yeah.
There's, I think it was the head of security for Docker, Diego.
Oh yes,
yeah,
Diego.
Who said, who preached reverse uptime, which was his version of that.
Yes.
A brilliant concept, makes perfect sense. I completely agree. The zero CVE angle, that there still must exist a window of time in which there is a CVE. I know there's a 24-hour rebuild, but in terms of zero, there is still a space where those images are vulnerable, even if it's not correlated back to the scanner, because it's a 24-hour window. And so while I broadly agree, talking about rolling updates of fleets of servers, you can't just turn them on and off again. So from that perspective, you can apply a fix that rolls out more quickly than the sort of drain and repave cycle, which, when you're talking about 5,000 to 10,000 plus servers, it is impractical to do in that shorter period of time. But yeah, there's space for both. I think they're complementary approaches, as you say. Supply chain and the runtime are the composition of the value provided by the service.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we talked a little bit about how, Mythos is not the only model out there, and that other models are increasingly being used to find vulnerabilities and exploits. Is that something that organizations should be doing? Should, consumers of open source, should maintainers be running, should they be doing that prompt about, you're in a CTF? Should they be running that kind of prompt over their own code?
It's funny because my team went away and did, doing various experiments over the moons. We're finding now 4 people will report the same vulnerability on the same day to a project. Oh, yeah. And you can go and you can see the reports. And part of that potentially is the model being bumped up because, we don't have pinning of models behind the API services that we use. And suddenly, or just full new model versions is probably an easy way of doing it. So plenty of people are doing it. We've seen the kind of slop reports. I think for internal first-party code, absolutely, an organization must do that. For the external code, to some extent, the service is being provided by the community in general. I think we'll reach a point fairly quickly where open source models have this capacity, and therefore because the API token cost on these things is insane, it's completely prohibitive for an already poorly funded project. So sort of happily it's coming through the community, but I think we'll reach this point fairly quickly where, I don't want to say it's as a service, it seems like a good alpha omega kind of OpenSSF service if they're listening. But yes, it's a useful thing to do, but again, if we look at the curl piece, there shouldn't be that many vulnerabilities in the latest versions of things. The dependency tree less, I'll couch that by saying in popular, well-maintained resource code.
And we all know that, things like OpenSSL were being used with horrendously bad vulnerabilities for an extremely long time before anybody actually disclosed or, I don't want to say discovered because they could have been discovered by nation-state actors. Yeah. But, that must still be the case even now, surely.
You make a good point there because the pwn-to-own competition, which is where you can get $1 million bounties, it was first real, let's put proper money at security, attacking automotive, attacking browser to kernel breakouts, sort of 6 chain to, the height of security vulnerability research. Public competition, loads of money. The top teams came from China for the last 2019, 20-ish, maybe even before that. And China said, dear Tencent, you're not allowed to go there anymore. We're starting our own. It's called the Tianfu Cup. You can't submit anything to NVD. We've got our own NVD database. It's also closed. So we've already seen this fracture, and latent vulnerabilities, we can be very sure that everyone has an equal level to some extent. The actual number of individuals in nation-state red teams, perhaps, let's say, is dramatically outsized as well. So to some extent, this will level up the West from that perspective. But latent vulnerabilities will definitely still exist.
I know that we can carry on talking for quite a long time, but I want to open up to the audience because I'm hoping there will be lots of questions. Amanda actually put her hand up first, so I will go to Amanda first.
Good. Great. I've got a mic, I think. Ross, put my mic on. What was it? Frank, get the door. I have 3 very quick points to make and not a question, but I would like you to respond to them, and they're legal points. Based on Andy's slide, which made me think.
Uh-oh.
And I used to be a lawyer. So the first point is that the Cyber Resilience Act does something, and it's the first time I had seen it do it anywhere in legislation. And the something it does is recharacterize software. Until that point in history, software was treated as a service, not a good. I thought it was a mistake in the Act, and I was encouraging people in the EU to push back when it first came out. And it turns out it is not. It is an absolute direct objective of the European Commission. And the consequences, product liability, now applies to software under the CRA, and historically it didn't. The second thing is the shift in liability. Historically, liability sat with the user. Nobody makes you use it, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. You chose to use it. There's a thing called consideration, not in Scots law, but in English and American and most of the world, not in mainland Europe. And that is something that changes hands in return. So if you just put something out, you could exclude your liability, and you didn't need to worry about it because you legitimately could do that. Now, because the liability has shifted from the user to the distributor, whether that distributor is an individual, an innovator, a multinational, if you are the first distributor into the EU, you're potentially liable, as I understand it. You need to go back and check it all, but as I understand it. And that shifts things because you are potentially liable for your gift to society in open source. And it is wrong It is wrong in my view, and you can tell it's quite a firm view, it is wrong because you have to have this transaction where the money is paid either by hiring skilled people, training skills, or going to a company and buying support. And if we look at this historically in open source, companies like Red Hat used an enterprise model for RHEL. They bundle indemnity into it to be able to take on the liability, and corporates feel comfortable buying that because it gives them some level of comfort for the risk. They self-insure. They do not buy insurance in the open market to cover that. And at the moment, you can't. So if you can't buy insurance, it means that when you come to negotiate indemnities, as a small innovator entering the market who is now liable, at law, not just depending on what you negotiate in a contract when money changes hands, you cannot go out there and buy the insurance you need to take on that liability. I could be wrong on all of this because I'm not in the EU, so I've not massively engaged, but I suspect I'm not. And a few tricky things have been done to us, which we will, as Andy says, be covering in our CRA report. It's a cyber regulation report that will be out on Tuesday. And what we've done is look at the CRA, look at the proposed legislation in the UK, which is going to be negotiated in the Commons on Wednesday. We're not panicking about it because there will be subordinate or secondary legislation that will start to touch on open source. This doesn't. And the Commons will debate that on Wednesday. So we all have to be aware, and this report we're pushing out will have bullet points in it because we will need lots of people when the time comes responding to try and persuade our government not to do what the CRA did, in my view. Andy, would you like to respond?
Do you want to comment?
You put the slide up, which made me think I've just been texting it to someone.
We blame you, Andy.
I accept it.
Sorry. If you want to move on to the questions, I completely understand.
I guess briefly, because I think we have to wait for the first legal case to come through to really understand what the position is. We don't know if we're going to endure legal vulture funds who just start spuriously opening cases against open source in general. And my understanding is broadly the same. As a producer of software with Flux and OpenBow, as the producer of open source that goes out upstream, Apache 2, all for free, will then sell services and closed source things to enterprises that they want us to build. If we don't keep the Apache 2 CNCF-owned version up to date, we're in trouble. That's what we know at this point. The concept of sort of selling patch hygiene and security is a pretty venomous one anyway, so we wouldn't do that. The point is everyone ships as quickly as possible for the consumer. But yes, it's sort of certainly for sort of large institutional organizations who've had very poor patch hygiene as a producer of code, they're the ones that I hope are caught, because then we have faster patch hygiene from everybody and get in a slightly better place. The rest is a minefield, and I really don't know. Any thoughts?
I know nothing about the CRA. I'm going to stay quiet.
Good answer.
There were a couple of other questions, weren't there? Gentleman
By
here
the way,
in
it's
front.
Diogo Monaco, who you're thinking of.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Quickly, on the slightly controversial question of is it advertisement versus is catastrophe, I think this point, as an is advertisement not catastrophe person, it would be trivial to prove us all wrong by just chaining these attacks against a non-Glasswing participant document. Here, you don't believe it, you don't believe it, we're going to do it. And
but that's what they did.
did they?
Yeah, if you look at the reports, they've got like hashes, and these hashes are the hashes of the reports they submitted to the companies. So they can prove afterwards, hey, this is the CV we were talking about.
Yeah, no, not just the CV, right? Because you told me that they could string together vulnerabilities, but like do the full exploit, right?
Yeah.
So
So
is any of that, no, because if it's done, the argument is settled, right?
well, if you look at Nicholas Calini's talk, then Nicholas Calini showed an exploit in Ghost, and he got full control. He was pulling the secrets out of the database. So they have, in my opinion, they have shown that, yes.
Yeah, I agree. The intel we have from customers who are in those projects is it's definitely doing things that we never thought were going to be possible. Is there a risk to critical national infrastructure? I mean, to your point, we hope that SCADA systems sit 1 degree removed, but they generally have no security in the protocol in the first place. And that's the, I forget the nuclear reactor.
Stuxnet.
Yes, that's the Stuxnet
Yeah.
problem. As soon as you're across the sneakyware, the air gap, all bets are off. And certainly, from Colonial Pipeline perspective, people were scanning for OpenVNC servers plugged into CNI. There's a lot. We've seen people go on, I don't know what you call it, kind of white knight bricking journeys, where they'll hack into things and they'll just brick it because they don't want the exposure, and that they're in the grey area, let's say.
Grant.
So for the pain that we're feeling with this in open source communities or adopters and users of open source, do you think that the pain that we're feeling, is this a moment in time of right now the situation that we're in, and as our open source projects come to terms with it, build up our processes and start making use of the tools, that these categories are going to go away? Or is there something fundamentally different that we need to be approaching security about here?
I mean, I think the world, I'm not quite sure where open source is going to end up. I think the world's kind of changed. I missed the panel earlier because I was rehearsing, apologies. I assume you covered some of that then, but in the break, I also saw the Ladybird project today announce that it's not accepting PRs anymore, right? So it's not, is that still open source if you're not really collaborating openly? And part of that was a security reason because, you get these large LLM generated stuff and it was hard to tell if there was intentional security backdoors. And yeah, the other thing is, why would I take a PR if it's written by an LLM when I can prompt that LLM myself? So we're in a very strange place, and I don't think we actually know where this is going to end up. So I do think things have changed. Maybe I've gone off on a slight tangent to exactly what your question was, but yeah, I don't think we know.
Yeah. Are we in a period of shock? Are we in something that will normalize? Yes, I believe so, because we're back paying security debt and, patch hygiene and development and deployment hygiene, all these things. So give it 6 to 9, maybe 36 months, everybody will have at least lifted themselves to the most important things to some point. I think we will see stuff get popped, unfortunately. It sort of remains to be seen. There are mitigations in advance. You spoke about intrusion detection, the last line of defense for any system. Everyone should have intrusion detection, full stop. Doesn't matter what else you're doing. Tools, controls are circumventable. They may be misconfigured. That really is the ultimate. Again, this is very old advice. It's not as if we're saying anything revolutionary. Yeah. But from that perspective, yes, a bit of a shock. However, to the point about should we just be running CTFs on everything, that's happening. And once we get to the latest versions of things, easier said than done, then everyone will have the same tooling. We've all been equalized by AI. There are 2 differentiators. One is the harness you put around it. The other is the quality of the human making objective decisions or prompting. And broadly, they're not even hugely differentiatable when you have these models. So from that perspective, yes. The second part of that is we do have a new class of, I hesitate to say class, but the way that models are playing CTFs against us, we never thought stringing together 5 2.5 CVE score, CVSS score CVEs would be dangerous. But in fact, it's turned out in many cases, these are very benign things that we wouldn't bother patching in the first place. So that there is a bit of an issue there. And again, it's all the old code that's just sat with no one looking over it. So the question is, as you say, for a large organization, should I just excise the code path that I need from this very large library and reduce my attack surface? Well, on the one hand, potentially, yes. You look at the Envoy project many years ago, that they did this. They were getting onboarded into Google to run all of their load balancers, so you can kind of understand, but sort of tree shaking to the point that you've only got what you need, one thing. The second thing, well, why don't you just vibe the thing and do it that way? Now, of course, you then lose any sort of CVE correlation, and everyone's then got to run their own mythos. The token economics do not work for that at this point in time. Open source may, but then we've all got to buy a load of NVIDIA to get those things running, and we probably don't have, we're into a power consumption question. Do we have the power to do that? Not in the UK, we don't. So
Yeah, just to be clear there, you're saying rather than pulling a library, just vibe code it yourself.
Vibe the path, yeah.
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 But then you lose any of the benefits of open source, and then the CV correlation and the security correlation just doesn't exist. The ostrich effect, perhaps.
I think that kind of point in time, or rather the transition, is much, much broader than really just security. It's more about the very existence of projects and the very way that we tackle software development in general. You know, we're in this very interesting stage where, you know, we talk about AI slot PRs, we talk about, you know, contributions that, like you say, you know, why bother taking a PR if you can just ask an LLM to do it anyway. I don't know how long it's going to take, whether, you know, this time next year or it's 10 years' time, that model will be at all the model we have. But I think from a security perspective, we have to just deal with the software we have today, and we have to have the tooling that copes with today. You know, I think things are going to look very different in 10 years, possibly a lot sooner. But for the time being, we have existing software and existing tools that we need to keep using.
I don't know if anyone's seen the Vibe OS video. Anyone seen that? Highly recommended. Go and look it up. The dude's vibed an OS. The thing auto-generates itself. You search for Microsoft Money 95 with Scott Hanselman having loads of money in. Pops up the UI. Money streams onto this. It's yeah. So potentially we're going to get to this world, right, where there's no determinism. There's no governance or analysis of what is actually going on. We rely on guardrails and hermetic injection of data to hope nothing goes awry. What level of trust would you imbue that system with? It's all very well to vibe calculator apps, but coming from a regulated background, that's market manipulation, like $1 trillion crash, grandma's dying with no fuel. You know, there's really serious side effects of just throwing away the liability-based risk system that we've built the law of the West on. And this question of, you know, unfortunately, self-driving cars kind of challenged this model slightly, because the trolley problem with a self-driving car, who's really ultimately, so I'd wait to eat my hat on that one particularly. But more generally, if we can't cede liability because it breaks the entire legal system upon which we're based. So I cling to that in some ways. But yes, Vibe OS is a strong recommendation.
I was a big fan of like Ian M. Banks' culture, you know, and I hope we're going to end up in the culture. I have no idea how liability works in that civilization, though. That's, you know.
I mean, you just get an implant, don't you? You can do what you want. So.
There were some more questions, I'm sure.
Who's next?
It's somewhere in the middle here. Right, one of these.
As someone who comes from an embedded background, there's a whole load of issues still in that space. I think the three biggest ones are vendor trees and hardware life cycles, and also there's certainly a nuance around how things are sold. So
How things are sold, was that?
yeah, so we see a lot of vendor trees that are running on LTS kernels, but which haven't been updated for the last 6 months. So they're being sold as LTS, but they're massively out of date. And we see vendor trees now that are basically not being updated at all on hardware that's still being shipped, because there's still hardware being produced using 10-year-old chips but aren't being supported by the manufacturers in any way for software. This is a major issue, because even those that have a will, smaller manufacturers do not have the ability to take, you know, essentially not upstreamed code and port it forward to new kernels. How do we approach this?
Well, in some ways, the CRA genesis, so correct me if I'm wrong, was the Mirai botnet wipeout. Maersk ransomware, $20 billion insurance payouts, and it's all because people are running hard-coded IoT with hard-coded passwords. And on top of that, stuff's not being updated. It kind of gets to where we are with the CRA. But it started off with IoT and hardware issues, or the software. Firmware, stuff that's actually printed, the printed circuit boards, we're in real trouble. That should have come under the same umbrella as the CRA in my mind. But unless somebody knows better, I don't think it's covered in that way. Hardware manufacturing, when I go and sit down in kind of business school things, which I go and do occasionally, I'm eternally grateful that I'm a silicon-based company, because it is so difficult to manage supply chains and stock and people and just in time. It's a luxury to work in software from that comparison. So thank you for your service, maybe.
Hi, thanks for the talks. Really interesting, first of all. Thank you. So my company doesn't have access to Glasswing, and it doesn't have access to Mythos. So we tried to build an internal hackathon to build the destitute men's Mythos. And the way it went is we basically built a lot of procedural logic, which combines the fuzziness and determinism. And one of the challenges was that we set as a goal was to try to use free tier for everything. And the results were pretty interesting because the system did find a lot of vulnerabilities that, like Opus 4.6, which was at the time the latest, couldn't. And to Adrian's point about the CFT prompt, have any of you experimented with combining the non-deterministic and deterministic logic to achieve similar results, and what were kind of the outcomes of that?
I've not. I think Andy's about to jump in. I'll let him jump in.
Yes. So 3 years ago at Black Hat, DARPA released the Grand AI Challenge, and that was a $3 million top prize. Trail of Bits, a company out of New York, won second prize with, I think it was called, I can't remember what they called the system.
This was the AIX Cyber Challenge.
Yes, exactly.
I was an open source advisor on that.
Oh, very good. And they did a fantastic readout write-up on Daniel Miesler's podcast on supervised learning. The guy used to run helicopters for the US Army, and he'd say when he inducted people, what happens if you lose this number of choppers in these many days? And the answer is it very quickly becomes non-operational and the arm is done. And he said, and that's how we then built this system. As deterministic as humanly possible, it is procedural as much as possible. Anytime you call out to an LLM, you've got the right to reject that response. You should be sampling it. It sits within the determinism, it sits within a window of determinism. The way that some of our customers in quant risk manage this is they're running 50 evals for every single thing they do, because they've got to prove to a regulator they're not going to mess the market up by doing this. You've got 60-page model risk management documents for all this stuff, and it's basically the same thing. How do you force determinism out of these systems? You either write a tight harness. There's a great Cloudflare blog about this as well. You either write a tight harness and minimize the opportunity for non-determinism, aggressively test the minimum context size that you can with the call, or you just throw the model at it, but it's extremely expensive to do it that way.
Yeah. That Cloudflare blog was very good. I did read that one, and that does talk about using different models and specialist models and so on.
I guess I've got two things to say about that. So one is my role as an open source advisor on that challenge. What they were really concerned about was these AI-driven tools finding, vulnerabilities, and they wanted to make sure that they were sending those to the open source communities in a responsible way, and a lot of it was about forecasting this potential for a huge number of vulnerabilities, and if they've been found by LLMs, but you as a maintainer don't want to have a conversation with an LLM, you want to have a conversation with a human, all that kind of stuff. I will say that, what are we, 2 years later, maybe not even that, I think we massively underestimated the impact on maintainers of having these sort of machine-generated vulnerability reports. So, we did our best, but I don't think we anticipated the scale and the velocity with which those would come. The other thing that I'm minded to think of, and this is not something I have tried myself, but I know there's a thing called Foundry Security Spec that is it's an open source spec that you're supposed to be able to plug in any model, and it kind of, it's like having a more sophisticated prompt than you're in a CTF find vulnerabilities. You know, it's supposed to be providing kind of guidelines and guardrails to the LLM on how you try and attack and report the vulnerabilities using whatever model you want.
Presumably, like Nicholas had put that CTF thing in to like step around the guardrail in the Mythos LLM. That's why she just say find the vulnerability.
Yeah.
And on that point, the Mythos isn't. There's no guardrails on Mythos. It's just just go for it. Yeah. Anthropic have been furiously trying to put the right guardrails on it so that when it's open sourced, you don't get access to the same thing.
Yeah.
However, go and look up Pliny the Liberator on Twitter. He's popped every single model, and he can just put his name into some of them, and it jailbreaks it. It's it's all there on Twitter. One of my guys is in his red team. It's bananas.
Will somebody put it off Twitter so I can look at it?
Coming back to the point that you mentioned earlier, do you think this is going to cause a lot of burnout in open source projects?
I think that's a great question, and I certainly have seen a lot of signs of burnout, burnout or burnout adjacent behaviours, because people really struggle with how do I interact with a report that's clearly written by an AI that maybe has a human or maybe doesn't have a human. How do you know? How do you deal with that in a way that is not disrespectful to the person who's, who has submitted that PR? And, to be honest, I think the very human approach has often been people just lose respect. And like you say, people just stop accepting PRs. It's definitely having an effect on, the mental health of a lot of maintainers, I think.
Yeah.
We had a brief chat about this outside. First of all, GitHub should have shipped a slop detector.
Yes.
Like, first port of call. Obviously, perverse incentives, so everyone wants us to burn tokens, so that will never happen. Then Linux Foundation announced you can use AI to generate something, but you can't respond in the issue thread on the pull request with AI. No way, you've got to have a human. If you do so, your pull request will be closed. All right, very well. There's a lot of hot finger closing and lots of buttons going on there. What happens if the same account does it 3 times? In my mind, there's a project from Mitchell Hashimoto, the HashiCorp founder, called Vouch. And it says, who's this person? What have they done? Are they slopping all over the internet? And I think, from my perspective, I would love to see that ingrained into everything. So unfortunately, that does kind of invert, to your point, if we don't take pull requests to open source. SQLite have never actually taken pull requests and sell the test suite, which I think is a model that has been incredibly successful for them. It's probably the most installed piece of software ever. I don't know how many, every single Android app has its own SQLite database, for example. So there are alternative models that stay open without accepting the contribution.
Like, I'm pretty sure Vault and so on, they very rarely took external PRs.
Yeah, which was part of the contention of they felt justified in the business license fork because,
that's right.
especially Terraform.
And I think there have been a lot of projects, certainly Cilium, is just one example where a lot of time has gone into trying to think up what our AI guidelines are going to be and requiring that there is a human who is fronting a PR and that people disclose what level of AI interaction there's been. And I think we've seen that attitudes to that move really quickly from, a few months ago, people really being on the side of saying, I just don't want any AI contributions, to people realizing, actually, maybe AI is useful for some of these contributions. Maybe it does make sense to let people use it for, testing. Maybe it does make sense to let people for whom English isn't their first language, let them articulate what they're trying to say, using an LLM to translate. But there still has to be a human who is going to stand behind it, who understands what they're contributing. And I think it also comes back to the point somebody else raised earlier about how do we train new maintainers if the maintainers don't understand what they're committing? I think that's incredibly important, but maybe we end up in N years' time, we don't need any human maintainers anymore because we've got the culture. I don't know. I think we've got 2 minutes left, so we've got more.
Sorry, just to jump in briefly. We maintain and sell enterprise support for 2 products. One is Flux, which is fully agentic backend for 16 different controllers. We've got all the automated patching, human in the loop, great. The other one is a Vault fork, it's OpenBow. The core maintainer joined us about 3 months ago, and as part of the process, he said, so what's your AI policy? So it was absolutely non-mandatory. We are an assurance-based consultancy, and the human element, liability, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, good, because somebody vibe coded a patch to OpenBow that pumped out the HashiCorp license at the top. Which, for a litigious organization which now owns HashiCorp, almost got them in incredibly hot water. So no AI, which for cryptography, there's serious security repercussions for the failure there. Application perhaps is more sensible, but a diametric opposition between the two in how they manage that.
Got 1 minute left, so one more question.
Okay, one minute. So it's a quick question, just based on what you've been talking about around. You mentioned burnout, Liz, and you talked, I think, Andy, about the technical debt bill coming. I've got maybe a alarming scenario where there's a lot of people, a lot of companies with this glasswing information. Imagine that information is leaked.
I'd say
has the open source community got the cash flow to pay off this debt really quickly?
I mean, it is essentially leaked. The level of DeepSeek with a harness is Mythos level, so it's all known by nation states now. Do we have the capability or the bandwidth to do it? Well, I think maybe Keith was saying earlier, we don't have the maintainers now to do it. So, not in my mind, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think also for the people who have been able to participate in Glasswing, and it's not just corporations. Linux Foundation has been part of that as well. Even for the participants, that doesn't kind of allow them a magic wand because it's good at finding vulnerabilities and finding exploits. It's not good at actually fixing them. So, it has. There are a lot of organisations who are part of Glasswing who are now more aware of the problem they already had.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not a magic wand. I can see Amanda looking very keen for us to wrap up. So have we got one final thought in 5 words or less?
Pay open source maintainers yesterday.
Very good.
We don't know the future. It's scary. I think that's maybe 6, by the way.
And I'll go with mitigate and update.
Oh, very good.
Very good.
All right. Thank you very much.